why is it so difficult for developers to implement proper frame pacing for a 30 FPS cap? I thought you guys mentioned there is a system call on Sony
Hmm.
consoles to have proper frame pacing. There is, and there is on Xbox as well, and Nintendo, by the way.
And
But so
PC.
many developers, and PC, yes, but so many developers seem to go with their own solution that has tons of issues. It's also not always. It's also not always an issue of having more compute overhead. Some devs, like From Software, almost seem allergic to proper frame pacing. Hopefully, Armored Core 6 is a turning point for them on that. Are they just being stubbornly wrong? This one from supporter. Right, what's all this then? Why do some games have poor frame pacing? Could the industry ever adopt a frame presentation standard to resolve it? Well, yeah, I mean, to begin with, all of the systems, as we just pointed out, they do have API calls that you can access, which do limit the frame rate, which do operate in multiples of the frame rate to give consistent frame pacing. The question is, why aren't they being used? And in some scenarios, in fact, in a lot of scenarios, it has significant input lag implications. We actually did a video where we used a patch from Illusion to enforce proper frame pacing on Bloodborne, and it massively increased the perception of fluidity in the game, but it did come at the expense of significant input lag. So, one of the arguments may be that a poorly implemented frame pacing cap that basically gets 30 frames per second out does actually have significantly lower input lag. However, I'm thinking back to when we did coverage of the original Destiny's beta, where we took Bungie to task on the poor frame pacing that was in that, and they actually fixed it, and they fixed it without significantly impacting latency, but it did take some time to implement. Anything more to add to that, John? Thoughts on this?
I mean, I think you're right on, and yeah, you do need to do some work to fix that. Obviously, it's funny though he mentions Armored Core 6 at the end because it's just a 60 FPS game, and I do see some confusion about this. When we talk about frame pacing, it's usually because they're trying to run a game at a frame rate that's below the refresh rate, right? If you're at 60 frames on a 60 hertz screen, this doesn't come into play at all. It's only when you're, say, at 60 hertz and you're trying to cap it to 30, or if you're at 120 hertz and trying to cap it to 60, where this starts to become a problem. It's just how long a frame persists on screen. And I think, oh man, you're right. If you just use that system level command, I think it's by default like triple buffered across the board. And that does add a bit of input lag, though it's usually worthwhile, I think. But obviously there's ways to solve that developers can do, which I think would help a lot. But obviously so I think what's probably happening there is like developers like, okay, system call too laggy. They use a different method. Oh, the latency's good. But then the people doing the testing maybe perceptually can't see the frame pacing issues, right? So in their mind, like, okay, this is the better solution because the input lag is less, and then they just leave it and they never return to it, or they don't understand what's going on, or they double down and say, no, I want the one with low input lag, rather than how can we fix this and have both.
Yeah, so Illusion had a patch for Resident Evil 4 based on the same engine for the PlayStation 4 version, which enforced 30 FPS, and it was using the Sony system level call. So there is, in theory, no reason why Capcom couldn't have done the same for Dragon's Dogma,
Right.
but for whatever reason they didn't.
The one thing to say about that, though, is I remember the Switch ports of Doom and Doom Eternal from Panic Button and id, of course, they helped as well. I talked to them about this because those do have some frame pacing inconsistencies, and they were acutely aware of it. But it turns out there was actually technical reasons for it due to the heavy load being placed on the system and things that were happening in the background tasks in the CPU. Basically, there was no way for them to completely eliminate those problems, and it had nothing to do with the way they V-synced the image. It was just down to what was happening. Yeah, it was just an issue with the game running on the Switch that they were not able to fully solve. And it sounds like they did try, but it's just there's too much unpredictable stuff. There's stalls happening in the background where, oh no, I gotta wait, that's interrupting it in other ways. So they're still getting an average of 30 FPS on those, but like there's these little inconsistencies and gremlins happening in the background, which causes it to stall for just enough that you end up with these frame presentation issues sometimes. So there's definitely cases, I think, where that might not be feasible to actually get a perfectly paced image, but usually it is.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Alex?
Everything that you all said. Recently, I was just trying out Horizon Forbidden West on the Steam Deck, and I was surprised to see frame pacing issues when using the system level cap. And I was reminded that they updated the system level cap on the Steam Deck to have less input latency. Was this not a thing that happened? And I think this might be a consequence of it for games like John was talking about on the Switch. When the system is overtaxed, and the Steam Deck can be easily overtaxed because it's a low-powered device, that it can potentially disrupt frame pacing. And to see that, I was surprised because my memory of playing the Steam Deck was like when I did my Crysis video was like perfect. It was just like perfect. No issue. So I was a little bit interested in that. Another thing is like when we talk about FSR 3 recently, there are gremlins that can cause that to have not proper frame pacing. And that's definitely something we're going to talk about probably when we do a whole nother video on FSR 3 in the future. But right now, like, it's not so clear cut, especially if you're not just using VSync. If you're doing VRR, for example, on PC, getting proper frame pacing is kind of easy, I would say, with VRR, because VRR kind of like just solves the issue for you. Yeah. It doesn't have to worry about flipping in the same way. But that's all I have to say.
Frame pacing, when we describe it in the PC space, can be quite different to how we describe it in the console space, where typically we're talking about frames being delivered in concert, in synchronization with the refresh rate, which is typically VSync. And you want to have the same level of persistence per frame. On PC, I'd say that most users, if they're not using VRR, FreeSync, G-Sync, they should be. Mm-hmm. And frame pacing basically means that whenever the frame is ready, it is presented, doesn't wait for a screen refresh, it generates a screen refresh. And at that point, if you're GPU limited, typically the frame currently being rendered is very similar to the one before, so you should get decent frame pacing if you're GPU limited, because the content doesn't actually shift that radically from frame to frame.
Right.
But obviously things, there can be, as you describe them, gremlins.
It's a great word.
There can be animation errors, which we talked about earlier.
Gremlins 3, the other new batch.